There was a question that the palace seemed adamant on avoiding for months. Every public appearance became a moment that people would relive for days, until Prince Louis was exactly where everyone anticipated him to be one day, leaning over the balcony and passionately reacting to the noise of jets overhead. His intensity could not be staged, and his expressions were uncensored. In each royal frame, he was the spark. Then that spark vanished without a trace. The gates were still shut. The timetable went on. However, the youngest royal vanished out of sight. No change. No lenient justification. There was only a determined silence. From here, I can jump down. It was the kind of unplanned, sly, and obviously him line that the people loved. Following months of silent conjecture, the palace has finally confirmed his sudden withdrawal from public life. It was a succinct statement, managed, well-written. Something heavier, though, remains between those smooth lines. Was privacy at issue here? A medical issue? A rift in the family that needed separation? Or was it a defensive choice made in private, away from prying eyes? It is reported that even longtime aides seemed uneasy. According to reports, Catherine's normally calm demeanor revealed obvious stress, and the question of what really caused Prince Louis to leave away, and why so abruptly, remains unsolved. No significant tipping point occurred, no headline crescendo, no slow retraction of appearances. It was silent. He was there at one engagement, energetic, expressive, and definitely himself. The following time, he was just not. Even those who were used to the rhythms of the monarchy were unnerved by the sudden change. One incident after another happened. The impression of his absence became deliberate rather than fleeting. There were no new school portraits made public. No casual family photos seemed to quell rumors. There was no happy wave from behind the palace walls. Once so obvious, so vividly real, the youngest son of the Prince and Princess of Wales had completely disappeared from view. Additionally, this withdrawal had no framing, in contrast to brief gaps that were previously observed throughout royal childhoods. No background. Simply exercise restraint. It was impossible to overlook the striking disparity during official appearances. Prince William continued to be calm and steady as he assumed his responsibilities with quiet determination. But there was room next to him. Prince George seemed much taller by William's side, more composed, and more aware of the duty that lay ahead. Princess Charlotte was as cool as ever, her controlled waves and calm grins betraying her increasing self-assurance. However, it seemed remarkably still where Louis would typically shift his weight, pull a face, or whisper something naughty. The family structure appeared to be intact at first glance, proper, balanced, until you saw the opening. Those who closely observe the monarchy are aware that even the slightest details can have significance. A quick look, a little motion of the hand, a figure placed with care. Nothing is accidental in an organization founded on symbolism, and absence has a message of its own. This has nothing to do with skipping any engagements. It was the repeating rhythm. One incident after another went by without him. No quick comment regarding a minor ailment, no casual remark on school obligations, no casual guarantee from a palace official. Nothing was provided by the communications apparatus, which is typically thorough and proactive, and quiet becomes its own headline when it persists. Commentators who usually focused on ceremonial etiquette and clothing choices started to change their tone. Light-hearted reminiscence over Louis's balcony antics gave way to more somber conjecture in online conversations. Why retreat from the young royal trio's most expressive member? Why take away a youngster whose spontaneity made the monarchy seem more relatable? Why not just a single sentence to reassure the public? Absence is never meaningless in a royal system that relies on visibility. Looks are calculated. Photographs are intentional. Every moment in public has a function. It has an impact when someone so essential to the family's contemporary story disappears. With every ceremony that went by, the void beside his father and brothers appeared to grow. The palace did not, however, shift. No explanation, no schedule, no recognition that anything at all had changed. The Wales family remained calm while performing their official obligations. The pictures were well executed. The choreography is excellent. However, looming over each newscast and meticulously arranged photo was the same silent query. Prince Louis was where? Then, following weeks of increased interest and an increasing sense of discomfort, the once unbreakable stillness started to break. And the more profound query surfaced. What was the shielding of the palace? Something personal? A calculated move? Or perhaps something much closer to the family's core? There was more to Prince Louis's disappearance from every royal event than a simple scheduling adjustment. There was a message. When the statement finally came, it was coded. It didn't make headlines when the silence eventually broke. It entered the public eye with caution, restraint, and deliberateness. The tone the palace takes when it is no longer possible to ignore the situation. An official statement was released following weeks of growing concern about Prince Louis and his complete withdrawal from public view. It wasn't long, organized, written with such attention to detail that each word seemed purposefully selected. The young prince would be taking protected time away from public life, according to the statement. It claimed that the choice had been made with his best interests in mind, and that was all. No additional background, no deadline. There's no word on whether or when regular appearances will resume. There was no mention of conjecture in the announcement. Concern from the public was not acknowledged. It only codified what was previously apparent to all onlookers. Prince Louis would not be doing royal duties in public. The wording seemed comforting on the surface. Protected time implies protection. Best interests suggests cautious, considerate parenting. However, the phrasing held an unexpected sharpness in its restraint for people who were used with the monarchy's communication approach. Yes, royal comments are usually modest, but they also frequently include nuanced framing, a tinge of comfort, a thread of context. This one provided nothing. It was clinical, contained, scant on purpose. In a matter of minutes, headlines started to circulate on international news sites. Analysts analyzed every line as if they were deciphering a contract. The Wales family supporters were relieved that the palace had at least admitted the problem. Others remarked on the language's seeming detachment, as if it were designed to prevent more research rather than to promote understanding. There was a noticeable difference. The absence had been noted but unconfirmed up until that point. It was formal now, recorded, unquestionable. However, the statement's inclusion was not what caught my attention the most. It was what was left out. The withdrawal was not described as transitory. There was no indication of a short break before return, no mention of a minor ailment, no reference to regular changes to the schedule. There was no tendency toward immediate reassurance in the wording. Rather, it firmly, yet softly, shut the door. And in doing so, the story moved away from conjecture on Prince Louis's whereabouts to a more profound and disturbing query: what needed to be safeguarded in the first place, and how long would this protected time last? Instead of implying a brief respite, the phrase conveyed a sense of organization and thoughtful consideration. This was no haphazard change. The decision was well defined. Wording is never a coincidence under the monarchy. Each sentence is crafted with consideration for institutional balance, public response, and legacy. It was much more intentional than a simple withdrawal to confirm that a young prince would withdraw from public life. Without specifying when that halt may finish, it seemed unrestricted. And that detail was important. The tone sounded more like cautious containment than typical privacy to many royal observers. Not only was the palace recognizing a lack, but it was also directing its story and molding its surroundings. They conveyed concern by referring to the decision as protective, but they conveyed urgency by providing no further explanation. Something had needed to be done quickly. One fact became inevitable as the statement spread and was taken in by people all around the world. Prince Louis had not just disappeared. His disappearance was officially documented. And if history has taught us anything, it is that finely polished royal language frequently hides a deeper layer. What precisely was being protected then? Because in retrospect, there had been a moment that was subtle and nearly imperceptible long before the official announcement. It happened in the middle of the day. The scene was well known. The balcony of the palace, the people below, the flags flying, the ceaseless flashing of the cameras. As they had done innumerable times before, the royal family formed up. Prince William was calm and erect. Catherine stood listening. Prince George looked straight ahead. Princess Charlotte smiles calmly, as she always does. Next to them is Prince Louis. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first look. However, upon closer examination and replay of that day's tape, onlookers started to notice minor variations. Usually gregarious and outspoken, Louis appeared uncharacteristically reserved. His hands did not wave freely. They were still securely gripped. He seemed to be in a rigid position. His balcony presence had lost the spark that had characterized it. Instead of leaning forward in excitement as the crowd cheered, he quietly shifted backward. He seldom ever looked directly at the public. The roar grew louder, and his shoulders appeared to tighten. Each detail was small on its own. They created a pattern when combined. What had appeared to be harmless restlessness started to take on more of the characteristics of discomfort. Following a public assessment of the video, a child behavior specialist noted signs that went beyond typical shyness. She said that rather than being a playful diversion, his stiff actions, lack of eye contact, and constant fidgeting could be symptoms of internal pressure. Although it is small, the difference is substantial, because the balcony moment no longer appears to be a typical public presentation when viewed via that lens. It begins to resemble the first crack that is apparent. However, Louis had nothing to do with the detail that stuck out the most. Catherine was involved. She turned to see her youngest kid for a brief moment, almost engulfed by camera flashes. It wasn't the loving, proud look a mother might give during a public event. It was faster than that, sharper, assessing. Her smile stayed put, poised as ever, but there was a change in her gaze. It was the expression of someone silently assessing the youngster standing next to her, not the situation, as though she were testing his ability to bear its weight. The restraint of Prince William's motions was as telling. He looked around the crowd for a moment during the national anthem, then allowed his eyes to wander past the family line. A senior aide stood in the shadows. William nodded the tiniest. The assistant reacted with equal tact and repositioned, taking a step backward. Nobody noticed at the time. It seems deliberate in retrospect. Following long-standing royal procedures, a number of photographers later quietly disclosed that special instructions had been issued before that appearance. According to reports, they were told to avoid showing Prince Louis in extended close-ups. It was not recommended to shoot alone. Lenses weren't supposed to stay. A last-minute change that felt out of step with standard procedure was described by one photographer. It seemed insignificant at the moment, administrative. It now feels strategic when compared to the bigger picture. Once characterized by cheery waves, music, and bright flags, that balcony view started to change in tone. Not just a party, but a watershed. Louis's peculiar silence. Catherine looked inquisitively. William's silent cue, the press's well-orchestrated dance. When combined, the small elements start to create a pattern that had developed just in front of your eyes. The change may have been in progress by the time the palace officially referred to his absence as protected time. Perhaps the balcony appearance was everything but ordinary. It might have been the last chapter before a well-planned retreat started behind closed doors, where worries were no longer kept under wraps and conversations turned from show to something much more important. The fundamental question isn't just what the public is being told after protected time, is accepted as the official reason. Long before the statement was written, that is what was being discussed within the palace gates. Perhaps the focal point of those discussions was a mother who was silently drawing a line rather than just standing for the cameras. What transpired next was far from any lens, even if the balcony appearance was the initial cause of public anxiety. Catherine's anxiety intensified as she entered the gates and entered hallways adorned with anticipation and history. There was no longer a quick look or a reserved smile. It took on a purpose, concentrated, individual. She started writing down her ideas according to people who were aware of the mood at the time. According to reports, key members of the royal staff and King Charles himself received handwritten notes. They weren't presented as calls for political change. They weren't memoranda of strategy. They had a mother quality, straightforward, sincere, immediate. Catherine made no appeal for pity. She didn't look to the public for approval. She requested some time, for endurance, and most importantly, for room. Room for her son to breathe without the burden of expectation. She could no longer ignore the changes that were happening behind closed doors. Louis, who used to be impulsive and boisterous, has become much more reserved. There have been instances of unexpected tears with no apparent cause. There were times when the laughter that characterized him was replaced by uneasy mumbling. According to reports, he retreated rather than interacted when palace employees visited. He started to feel uneasy, even at the sound of camera shutters, which used to be a normal part of royal life. Previously normal tutoring sessions become tense. Reluctance replaced enthusiasm. Curiosity gave way to resistance. These weren't fleeting periods to Catherine. They were signals. She started to think that for a youngster who was still figuring out who he was, the constant attention that came with living as a royal, the rituals, the scrutiny, the symbolism, was becoming to be too much. However, in the organization she had married into, individual choices are rarely kept private. Every action has repercussions beyond of the immediate family. It is reported that advisors advised prudence. They cautioned that a total withdrawal would spark a flurry of conjecture. The headlines would get more intense. Silence would create a void that would be fertile ground for gossip. Continuity, which depends on image, is the cornerstone of the monarchy. The advice was stern but measured. Preserve the story. Maintain stability. Remain calm. However, Catherine didn't care about appearances. Her son was the one. Her son became the sole focus of her attention. She was aware of the institution's workings because she was Princess of Wales and might one day become Queen. The significance of continuity. The standards associated with public duty. But something much more immediate was tugging at her as a mother. Later, some in the family alluded to a shift in her tone at internal meetings. She was no longer making logistical adjustments or calmly going over calendars. She was challenging presumptions, pushing the boundaries of expectations, retaliating against habits that had previously been ignored. According to reports, the breaking point occurred before Louis was supposed to appear with Prince George and Princess Charlotte during a formal reveal. He refused to leave his room the morning of the event. Efforts to gently persuade him failed. No reassurances arrived. Promises were meaningless. The opposition was determined rather than theatrical, and Catherine saw what she had been afraid of in that silent rejection. But the palace schedule was set in stone. There was confirmation of appearances. Positions are assigned. It was obvious what was expected. Louis was supposed to be there. Catherine, on the other hand, took a decision that had far-reaching effects. She didn't go either. It was an unusual absence for someone who had established her public persona on poise and dependability. It registered instantly in the corridors of the palace. This was no small change. It was a statement. If it meant disrupting the system to protect her child, she was ready to do it. According to reports, senior aides were uneasy. They had broken protocol. An institution known for its tenacity and customs was not used to public duties being reshaped by emotional priorities. Catherine, however, did not compromise. If anything, her confidence grew. Direct insistence developed from what started out as private correspondence. Once centered on optics, planning discussions now included a hint of tension. Advisors discussed precedent and perception. She mentioned well-being. The topic of conversation had changed. Image management and scheduling efficiency were no longer the focus. It dealt with the psychological toll that continual exposure takes. And one fact became indisputable as the tension inside those ancient walls increased. Catherine had stopped discreetly requesting modifications. She was calling for reform. And another family member was starting to listen to her. The atmosphere apparently grew heavier as pressure increased behind palace doors, particularly inside Clarence House's walls. The tension was no longer limited to tense meetings or private correspondence. It was intimate. Because Prince William was no longer able to stand by and act as a neutral figure juggling institution and family, as Catherine's quiet battle intensified. Someone had drawn a line. He had to choose his position now. Catherine's worries had been heard by William long before anyone else did. He had observed his son's gradual transformation, including his hesitancy, withdrawal, and times when his actions didn't align with the mainstream narrative. As the heir apparent, he also had a clear understanding of another thing. The organization is not readily swayed. What started off as a mother's request was now becoming into something much more significant. The location of the meeting was Clarence House, behind closed doors. No cameras, no assistants nearby. King Charles III was seated in the middle of the room. Queen Camilla nearby, calm and perceptive. Senior employees stayed just outside the inner circle, far enough away to allow for solitude but close enough to be called. William showed up with a folder. His manner was calm but aloof, according to those later informed on the mood, nearly surgically controlled. As though to keep each sentence crisp, he had prepared it beforehand and drained it of feeling. He could no longer ignore the documents in that folder. Copies of the letters that Catherine wrote by hand. Internal documents detailing Louis's most recent changes in behavior. Most importantly, there was a written medical caution from a doctor who had evaluated the issue and recommended restraint. The message was clear. The youngster may experience more stress if they are exposed to the public in the future without making any changes. Calmly, the conversation started. Without raising his voice, William outlined the issues. He mentioned the changes in feeling Catherine had seen. He wondered if Louis was ready for the intensity and speed of royal prominence at this point in his life. He clarified that this was not a denial of responsibility. It has to do with safety. According to reports, King Charles responded calmly. He reminded the audience that the monarchy had endured for many generations by striking a balance between personal adversity and societal expectations. He stressed that while changes may be investigated, the institution itself couldn't seem vulnerable. The foundation of public confidence was stability. One insider report states that Camilla then made a useful insight. Maybe, she said, Louis was just going through a tough time, something transitory, something maturing. It's possible that the reassurance was the purpose of the comment. However, it landed in a different way. Those in attendance reported a noticeable change in William's posture. The confined serenity vanished. The distance disappeared. It was replaced by a father. According to reports, he pushed the folder shut and got up from his chair. The restraint vanished when he spoke again. He made it clear that his son was not a positional symbol, not a useful tool for bolstering popularity indicators, not a figure for optics stabilization. The room reverberated with the implication, the welfare of a child must come before one's image. Then there was silence. Not well-crafted comments or the calculated quiet of press departments. A thicker quiet. The type that results when tradition and something very personal clash, and neither side is prepared to back off. was a different situation. The situation was a different situation. The situation was now different. However, the room's emotional intensity was remarkably familiar. William did not change his stance. He wondered if some advisors had started putting public comfort ahead of personal well-being. He made direct reference to the medical caution, not as a personal opinion or interpretation, but as official professional guidance. This was no longer an optical argument. There was a clinical warning on the table. In an effort to defuse the situation, King Charles reiterated that everyone in attendance wanted Louis to be okay. However, an irreparable event had already occurred. William's duty as a father and his loyalty to the crown had clashed. Furthermore, it was impossible to ignore or file away that collision once it had happened out loud inside Clarence House. The dynamic had changed by the end of the meeting. The system that had molded him from birth had been contested by the heir apparent. And when a challenge like that is voiced within the institution, it doesn't go away without a fight. It persists. It compels a reaction. When the organization retreated. Following the altercation, there were apparently small but noticeable changes in the royal household's environment. No one had been yelling. No doors were slammed. No spectacular departures. But someone had drawn a line. Catherine had stated her stance already. It had been reinforced by William. The institution now had to choose between resisting and recalibration. Private discussions between communication strategists, private secretaries, and top advisors took place in the days that followed. Convincing Catherine to change her mind was no longer the aim. The goal was to adjust without appearing unstable. Two pillars have always supported the monarchy's operations: narrative control and time. Both were equally necessary in this case. An internal agreement started to emerge gradually. Prince Louis would be excluded from future public appearances, not as a short-term adjustment or a casual hiatus, but as a planned and deliberate retreat. They updated the royal calendar. They re-evaluated appearances. Silently, schedules changed. These adjustments were not accompanied by a big announcement, but there was no denying the change in the palace halls. The organization has taken a step back, not because it had lost, but rather because the heir's boundaries had finally been upheld. And that decision would soon change the public's perception of the well-chosen phrase, protected time. Were discreetly deleted from documents associated with high-profile events. No broad announcement was made. Rather, the communications were managed precisely. They carefully guided royal reporters toward wording that focused on security and privacy. It was a serene tone, comforting, contained. Existing guidelines were reminded to photographers. Several reports claimed that they were gently urged not to pursue extended close-ups or aggressive angles. There would be no images of chaos, no indication of retreat in sight. It would appear flawless if this transition were taking place. That precise approach was mirrored in the official statement when it was released. It was no accident that the phrase "protected time away from public life" was used. Without recognizing the crisis, it conveyed concern. It suggested careful preparation without displaying haste. The wording stabilized, which is what royal wording has always done best. The palace didn't brush off worries or allow for more in-depth investigation. It established a barrier that was cool, collected, and firm. However, there was something important hidden beneath that constructed phrase. The institution has aligned itself with a paternal line for the first time in this generation. Despite William's challenge within Clarence House, centuries of tradition remained intact. Royal duty had not been rewritten. However, it had made the mechanism flex. It was evident from the future king's words that his offspring would inherit responsibilities, but not at the expense of their welfare. Reactions were mixed among palace circles. According to reports, some advisors saw the change as an unavoidable modernization, recognizing that the monarchy must change to reflect shifting views on mental health and childhood. Others were concerned about precedent. What effects would it have on the following generation if one young royal were to withdraw due to emotional stress? The monarchy has always been associated with endurance. It took silent adjustment instead of overt reform to rebalance that expectation. Those who knew the environment said Catherine did not consider the result a victory. Tension gave way to release, albeit a measured one. The goal had never been to overthrow the establishment. It has to do with protecting a youngster. The tension of the previous weeks persisted despite the subsequent settlement. All it did was divert it. Only the aristocratic exterior was visible to the general people beyond the palace boundaries. A succinct declaration, a calm family, a story about protected time. However, beneath that exterior was something much more illuminating. A family made a different decision when tradition took a break. Public appearances persisted. Prince William remained steadfast. Catherine did not panic. Prince George seemed more and more ready. Princess Charlotte poised with assurance. Disciplined, dependable, and in accordance with expectations, the family structure appeared to be intact. However, the area next to them now had a new significance. No longer was it inexplicable. It was the outward manifestation of a personal reckoning. This was not a moment of collapse for the monarchy. The crown was still there. Tradition remained unwavering. The ancient walls continued to have power, but priorities had changed within those gates. A future king had drawn a line, indicating that well-being would take precedence over legacy. A future queen had pushed for recognition of her position. Additionally, Prince Louis, who has since been officially removed from public life, was protected by wording designed to safeguard the youngster and the organization that cares for him. The explanation seemed reasonable and adequate to the general people. Protected time. It had a measured sound, accountable. But beyond that calm facade, the ramifications of what had just happened were still developing subtly. This wasn't just a change in the schedule. At the heart of the royal household was a rebalancing of image and humanity. Could Prince Louis's disappearance be a sign of anything more significant, such as a subtle internal reorganization or a change in the definition of responsibility by royal power? Not a revolution, however, a change, one that might subtly change the way the crown is passed on to the following generation. Now that Louis was formally out of the public eye, the strain appeared to be contained at first. The palace had made its announcement. The calendar kept ticking away with its usual accuracy. There were ceremonies, engagements took place. The organization continued. But beneath that constant beat, something felt off. Monarchy has relied on visibility for centuries. Royal heirs and their loved ones are progressively exposed to public expectations from an early age. Appearances on balconies, national celebrations, ceremonial unveilings. Every instant increases awareness. Continuity is reinforced by each image. Every wave makes things more familiar. Being visible is not a coincidence. It is fundamental. Furthermore, it indicates something more than ordinary privacy. When that visibility is purposefully diminished, particularly for a kid placed within the future framework of the monarchy, it indicates re-examination. The location of Prince Louis is not the only question at hand. That's what this moment is all about. Because the most important changes within an organization aren't often grandly announced. One absence at a time, they develop in silence. In the monarchy, every public photo has a function. It strengthens stability. It provides continuity. It subtly indicates that the building is still there. Departing from that meticulously crafted route is never inconsequential. It changes how you see things. It brings about change in an organization that hardly ever recognizes the necessity of change. Scandal was not the catalyst in this instance, not under political pressure, not a catastrophe outside. It came from conviction within the family. Despite being told to tone down her worries, Catherine decided to continue. Prince William brought those worries to Clarence's house, seeking a re-examination and citing documented medical warnings. A remarkable turning point was produced by the union of the heir's power and the mother's resolve. Tradition was intact. However, it hesitated. It has not always been easy for royal offspring to re-enter the spotlight after taking a hiatus from it. Predictability and rhythm are essential to the monarchy. If you break that routine, doubt persists. When things change, will Prince Louis progressively resurface? Will his visibility be permanently reduced in the future? Or has a silent precedent been established that will change the way royal childhood is handled in the present day? Those questions are probably being carefully considered inside the palace walls. The monarchy is negotiating more scrutiny at this time. Every expression is amplified on social media. It only takes a few minutes to analyze each frame. Compared to previous generations, young royals today confront very different pressures. Protection might no longer be seen as weakness in that setting. It might be evolution. This chapter goes beyond William's personal family issues. He will inherit both the crown and the burden of adapting it as the future king. By promoting his son's mental health in addition to his sense of obligation, he brought about a little but significant shift. Catherine's perseverance strengthened that change. The picture of a calm royal couple now has more background. Boundaries are established and protected behind the smiles. The public has responded with interest. Many people show comprehension. Others wonder about the long-term effects. However, one sentiment is consistent across viewpoints. The absence of Prince Louis seems significant. It is more than just a balcony with a missing person, more than a blank spot in pictures of ceremonies. It symbolizes a subtle transition within one of the oldest organizations in the world. The monarchy has endured wars, abdications, and generational changes in the past. Careful, occasionally recalcitrant evolution has been essential to its longevity. The events that transpired within the palace in the last few weeks were not dramatic. No confrontations were broadcast on television, no broad declarations, just a calm remark, with a child disappearing from view. However, even small choices have an impact when a future queen insists on establishing boundaries and a future king questions accepted conventions. For the time being, Prince Louis might be protected from cameras. However, the decision that took him out of the spotlight still has an impact and is subtly influencing the course of this regal tale. One more question remains after that. What, in your opinion, really forced the palace to back off? Necessity, strategy, or something much more intimate? Comment below with your thoughts.